that making bread, I think, can give us this feeling of safety and security. It gives us a sense of belonging. So it allows us to recreate inside ourselves that feeling of home. And I think that's what everybody was craving. And I think they'll have got that from making bread. So there are so many different ways, I think, in which bread can contribute to our psychological health. And because it's such an incredibly rich, multi-sensory experience to get your hands into dough and to be making bread, it's the perfect medium for learning to practice mindfulness. And I think that that can be incredibly helpful and a very good little building block in our mental health toolkit. I think that I'm very much preaching to the converted here when I remind us how important real bread is when it comes to having a good nourishing diet. And a good nourishing diet is a very important part of self-care. I think we understand so much more now about how the microbiome plays such an important role in our health as well as our physical health. And of course, good real bread is the perfect prebiotic, a feast for our gut microbes. So very important. And of course, good self-care, feeding ourselves good nourishing food, is giving ourselves the message that we're worth looking after. And that's very important for our mental health as well. In making bread, we have the opportunity just to go on learning. I fully expect to be learning new things about baking bread till the end of my days, and I think that's wonderful. It gives us the chance to be creative. There's something very profound about the creativity, and we make bread, we put something of ourselves into that bread, we put it out into the world, it's received by other people, it's eaten, it's enjoyed, and then something is reflected back to us, which we can take in and which feeds us psychologically, very importantly. I think we have a chance to be true to our values. We have a chance, as Zev's film so beautifully describes, of connecting with other people. And I think I've learned so much from the process of making bread that it's a part of my life now. It's part of me. And I'll leave you with a couple of the key lessons, the life lessons, if you like, that I feel I've learned from bread itself. The first one is to do with imperfection. Now, it may be that the more professional bakers among you don't have mistakes, but I still do have the occasional underproved or overproved loaf, or something that sticks to the tin or is slightly raw in the middle. And having those opportunities to learn to accept the imperfections and the flaws of my imperfect loaves, I think has given me the chance to get much better at accepting imperfections in myself and the imperfect life that I live and that we all live, because that is an existential reality. None of us are perfect. We all make mistakes. So in accepting the imperfect loaf, I've learned to accept the imperfections in myself, and that's a very good way to be able to develop self-compassion, which again is very important for our well-being. And then I suppose the fundamental metaphor of bread making is the metaphor of transformation, that we start with this inedible flour and we end up with this delicious, nourishing loaf. And so every time I take a loaf out of the oven, I use it as an opportunity to remind myself that transformation is possible. I'm looking at transformation. Change is possible. It's never too late to change. And being reminded of transformation in my bread, I'm reminded that transformation is possible for us all, for us as people too. And I think that that's a very important and hopeful thing for us to carry with us, especially in these difficult times. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. John, are you there?
Hello. Yep. I'm John. Say again?
No, I just said, do you want to add to that?
Well, I think some of what I'm going to say does add to that. I think I won't have as my focus won't be obviously on therapy, because that's not my training. But a lot of the things that Pauline said are things that I recognise, having spent more than 30 years baking bread. I jotted down a few things here. Bread, my attraction to food and to bread is about feeding people, fundamentally. my mother was Hungarian, and food was really important, and sort of family gatherings, extended family gatherings. So for me, making any sort of food and bread, the process of it kind of connects me to the people who are going to eat it. So there's something, I don't know, there's something very, I don't know, it connects me to people, just even the process of it and imagining who's going to eat it. So maybe I'll talk about the schools project a little bit later. And there's an aspect of nutrition, which is an interesting one as well. But I suppose initially it's the sort of mental well-being side of things. You know, that bread is fundamentally a very simple thing: flour, water, salt. And that simplicity, there's something really lovely about that simplicity. And yet, as Pauline said, it's a lifelong endeavor that none of us will ever stop learning about making bread. There's something, I remember when I first realized that bread was just essentially flour, water, salt. And I must have been, I think it was when I was about 19 or something, and I was, maybe 18 or something, and I'd got my first book about bread, and I was just really amazed that this thing didn't have eggs or other things in it that would help it give it structure and whatever. There's something about that simplicity that is fundamentally reassuring, that something so incredible can come of such simplicity. There's the feeding people side of things, connecting to people. And the other thing about bread is that you can learn to bake bread from a book. Some people are very good at just getting a book and going solo. But really, to make leaps and bounds and to start feeling like you have mastery, and I say mastery there not in terms of perfection, but just real satisfaction in what you're doing, having someone show you or demonstrate just gets you so much further, in my opinion, in my experience, I should say. So
You got frozen. John, you're frozen. Hello? Yeah, you're better now.
I'm better. Oh dear. So no, I was just saying that,
30 seconds or so.
oh dear. Did I talk about, I was talking, I think when I froze, about the fact that when you're learning, you learn so much faster with other people. That you can do it as a solo pursuit, but really you learn a lot faster with others. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, cool. So there's something about connection there. The other
Frozen again. Should we go on to
one of the others?
John?
Oh dear.
Okay, yeah, let's come back to you.
Yeah, I think maybe. Yeah. Okay.
Later on, if you could talk about are you still doing that, your program to introduce bread into schools?
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's my question to you, but we'll let William take over, and that will give Andrew enough time to think over his his contribution. All right, William.
I'm good to go if you want to.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think Andrew said he's ready. Are you ready, Andrew?
Oh, do you want to, Andrew?
If you want, I'm happy to follow William. It's up to you. Yeah.
It's up to you. Who are you ready, William? Are you ready, Andrew?
I'm always ready. I'm always ready.
We'll let Andrew wrap it up with his mastery.
Okay. All right. Well, first of all, it's a brilliant movie. I've really enjoyed watching it. I've watched it twice now. And thank you for the invitation to this. Also, thank you for your contributions to my Bread History and Practice Facebook group. Those of you who aren't members of it, you'll see a different aspect of Zev. He's posting these historical photographs every day, or sometimes more than once a day, that have been very helpful to this group in anchoring our sense of recent bread history. So I always start my talks about bread the same way. Bread is an invention. Bread is not an agricultural crop. There is no bread harvested from trees. Bread is not dug up from the ground. Bread is an invention. And there's everything about what we do with bread that is a product of the culture, the choice of the grain, the choice of how finely to mill it, how finely to sift it, if at all, bake it as a loaf or a flat bread, sour leaven, yeast, just steam, baking soda, Irish soda bread, all of those are cultural choices. And when we look up at the stars at night, when we're fortunate enough to have a Milky Way, what we don't find there is the recipe for the best bread or even good bread. Because this recipe, what makes good bread or best bread is in our hearts. Is in our hearts. And of course, Andrew speaks about the bread that's the best bread that is in our heart now. Now, when you go back as far as we can go, which so far is 14,400 years ago, to an epipaleolithic site, a Natufian culture in Jordan, and the archaeobotanists analyze a charred crumb of bread. What they're able to tell is that this bread was sifted. This was 4,000 years before agriculture. Every Neolithic bread that I am aware of that has been gone through an analysis by a scanning electron microscope, the flour was sifted. So the idea that people always ate whole grain bread, it isn't really, it's really not accurate. Poor people ate a bread. I mean, if you're just desperate, you're eating bread for horses, or even turnip or something, not a grain bread. But the breads tended, even the coarsest bread in Europe or in England, the coarsest bran was sifted out. So it wasn't this idea we used to all eat that whole wheat bread. It's really not accurate. The most common flour in the past, which we can find in Roman, from Pliny, and also from the size for bread documents and other sources, was a bread that was about an 80% extraction. And when you do that, by hand at home, with a mill and sifting, you get this flour that behaves like a white flour, but it still is definitely gray and will give you some of those probiotic substrates or the feedstock for the probiotics that Pauline talked about. This idea that we have now of real bread that Andrew describes, and it's not, of course, just Andrew, it's a cultural idea. It implies unreal bread. And so, a dichotomy, what's real, what's not real, that's in our hearts, though. That's in our hearts. I feel in terms of diet, I've recently been diagnosed as being diabetic, at least on the borderline. I go up and down. And so what you learn when you're diabetic is it isn't that you can't eat any carbohydrates, but that you need to balance them. You balance them with a protein or some more roughage. And I think that when we think about bread and diet, that for those of us, none of us are eating bread as the staple food, that we should see that, white bread can be okay, but make sure you eat salad. It's about, about being balanced, about a balanced diet. And lastly, because I know we just have 2 seconds to talk, Pauline's talking about baking bread at home. And historically, bread that was baked at home was baked by poor women. And from the late 18th century into the 19th century, in both the UK and the United States, poor women were excoriated for making sour bread, sour tasting bread, because before the germ theory of disease, sourness was identified with gastroenteritis, and women were accused of making their families sick. Home bread that was dense made their family sick, and that was pressure that was put on the woman. American cookbooks are fabulous for these texts where the women are encouraged to work the dough as hard as possible because that shows their love for their husbands. And what a big change, one of the biggest changes in the history of bread really has been this recent change where women are not making bread at home to feed their families, but we are making bread at home recreationally, and a lot of the we's are men. There's been a real masculinization and professionalization of the home baking. It's totally unique that people at home would be trying to make a bread that looks like a bread in the bakery, which of course is many people's goals, especially of us men with the male chromosome set. So I think that's what I'd like to say right now. And I look forward to hearing Andrew and to discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Andrew?
Well, thank you. The trouble with bread is that you could go from one end of human experience to the other, all in almost in one sentence. And it is such a fundamental thing that it's quite difficult to know how to even begin to sum up any three wonderful contributions there that have all said many things that I completely agree with, and have focused on aspects of that kind of ineffable quality of bread and bread making, which I think is the explanation as to why we're all actually sitting in front of screens now all over the world and sharing our experiences. I just wanted to pick up on a couple of things. First of all, William, your sourness issue is fascinating. You know, I pointed out in the past that the kind of 20th century and late 19th century manuals of bread making in the UK always consigned sourness to the troubleshooting chapter of the book, you know, what to do when your bread goes sour. And I think there's some risk of a confusion or a sort of overlap between sourness and spoilage, which is a marker of the loss of a tradition which was alive and well in the only 20 miles across the Channel in France and all points east and north, where to this day sourness, of course, is a prized attribute of bread because it signifies appropriate fermentation. And what's strange to me is that this sort of pillorying of sourness should have become in the USA as well, with its large influx of continental European immigrants, should have become so dominant. I would wonder whether some of those who came from Scandinavia and from Germany and Poland and places would have hung on to a live tradition of sourdough baking rather longer. We know, for instance, that the gold prospectors in the 1860s were, according to Jack London anyway, called the sourdoughs because they carried with them bits of starter, and apart from finding an alcohol substitute in the hooch that formed on the top of their sourdoughs, they used them to make bread because there was obviously no source of yeast up the Yukon or wherever they were looking for gold. And so that was a live tradition in the mid-19th century. And I don't suppose that they or their families would have been pilloried people for producing sour bread, rather the opposite. But to go on from that, I was reminded about the connections with mental well-being and the really interesting things that Pauline has just told us, but also has put in her wonderful book. At the turn of the millennium, there was a little project called the Food and Mood Project. I think it had some millennium funding, and it was trying to look at the connections between diet, nutrition, mental health. And I somehow picked up a magazine or some sort of printout from this project in which my attention was turned to the connection between the mineral selenium and the function of an enzyme in the brain called glutathione peroxidase, I think, which operates at the area of the brain which affects mood and controls depression and that kind of thing. And I was at that time, for other reasons, talking to a lady called Margaret Raymond, Dr. Margaret Raymond, who was at Surrey University doing research into selenium as an antioxidant and cancer preventative. And I was asking her, you know, might this be true? Might there be something in selenium which would, which if we could put more of it into our bread would actually actively lift our mood? And of course, it was at that time that I was also trying to figure out and get clear in my own mind the importance of processing the basic sort of raw materials in flour in a way that made them optimally digestible to the human body, but also optionally functional in the sense of producing the good effects that we knew these compounds could produce if only they were given a chance, and not either occluded by the use of additives or simply inactivated or not activated by very, very short fermentation. And I came up with the idea, along with Margaret Raymond. Well, she didn't actually really approve the idea. She thought it was a bit too much like clever marketing. But I thought if I could find out the number of selenium, the best source of selenium, which turned out to be Brazil nuts, and put that in a sourdough loaf, I could market it on the basis of the research done in this Food and Mood project under the slogan, "Eat bread, be happy." And those of you living in the UK might remember that when the railway system in this country was still under national ownership, there was a wonderful film made with a sort of early kind of stop motion, little bit of CGI, where somebody relaxed on an intercity train to a tune which said, "Relax, be happy." And so I thought "Eat bread, be happy" would be just a great slogan to introduce people to the thought that actually there are compounds in bread, there are raw materials and additions to bread which could verifiably, on the basis of the latest molecular biology, actually improve brain function. And I actually put that sort of idea tentatively to the Advertising Standards Authority because I didn't want to do it and then be struck down, as it were. And they told me to take a running jump and that they would come down on me like a ton of coal if I tried to market a loaf like that. So I didn't do that, but I did continue to pursue the research a little bit, but it turned out to be fiendishly difficult to know because the analysis of selenium content of Brazil nuts is so variable. It was hard to know how many slices of this lovely bread we should recommend people should eat. And the background to this is all in the loss of selenium from our bread when we transitioned from using mostly North American wheat, where soils are richer in selenium than in the UK, to homegrown wheat. And it remains a serious problem in Britain that bread made with homegrown wheat will be relatively low in selenium. And so if people are depending on it for quite a chunk of their diet, they will, as national statistics show, fall below the recommended daily allowance of selenium. Now, that's as may be, but in the course of trying to understand more about this business of brain and gut and so on, what has emerged from my reading in recent years has been that the complexity of the interactions between food ingredients in our bodies, in our digestive systems, and the effects that they have are so, the complexity is massive, and that if we try and intervene at the level of increasing the intake of this or that specific compound, we're going to probably have little or no effect, or possibly simply trigger unexpected side effects somewhere else. So that the name of the game seems to be to try and understand how we can maximize, or well, let's say optimize the diversity of the potential for multiple beneficial interactions in the chain of health, which begins in the soil. So we now know a lot about the importance of diversity of the microbiology of soils, in which plants will gain resilience and health to the extent that there is that complex web of life going on in the soil. And that therefore, if we choose genetically highly diverse populations, land races, mixtures, evolutionary varieties, call them what you like, of grain, which is something that we're trying to do in our research up in Scotland, then the likelihood is that if you mill that flour, and I make no apology for saying that we do it in as wholemeal, specifically to avoid throwing away any of the benefits that we think we might be accumulating by choosing more nutrient dense varieties. So we're not going to sift out some of those nutrients. What would be the point? But if we choose those varieties and mill them into whole wheat, then if we ferment them with sourdough, we activate the highly complex relationships between yeasts and bacteria and the complex microbiology of the soil, of the stomach as well. And it seems to me that in all this, what's going on is that, yes, transformation is of course occurring, and it can occur to a deeper or more profound extent, to the extent that we ferment our sourdough thoroughly and in appropriate conditions. But what's fascinating is that the research emerging about the importance of short chain fatty acids in the gut and the connection between that and the brain seems to suggest that it's not so much the individual micronutrients or compounds that are having this beneficial effect. It's something to do with the space between them, the relationship between them, and that balance, and that William talked about, and the sort of the medium, if you like, or the communication network is the message that we get from bread. And that's why it seems to me to be no accident at all that mental well-being comes from the whole process of engaging with bread, not just the ingestion of the well-fermented bread at the point of the eating act, but in the whole process from soil to slice, or even further beyond the slice into the stomach and so on. And I think that we're going to find as time goes on that a lot of understandings about the importance of diversity at multiple levels in our agriculture and microbiome and society and so on converge around this idea about meaning being in relationship and in balance and in communication, rather than in the hard materialism of the micronutrients or the physical objects. And you know, I know next to nothing about quantum physics, but I understand that it's in that sort of area that philosophy and science seem to find it easiest to talk to each other. And bread, of course, is right there in the middle of that too.
Okay, thank you very much. So last time this is only the second event that I've hosted like this. So last time there was a way to raise your hand and you'd go to the top of the list. So does everybody see that, or does nobody see that?
No.
No?
Remind us how you do it, Zev, even though I tell my group to practice it. I've forgotten how to actually find the hand.
You
All
go
right.
into participants and then you press raise hand.
Sorry?
You click on participants and then you can raise hand.
Uh,
It gives you the option.
Oh yeah.
okay,
Yep.
so
Yep.
All right, so if I'm sure there's other people that, including the other panelists, the other thing that I have to say is that I'm recording this. So if anybody has any objections, either let me know if it's any of the panelists. If not, just don't ask questions or stop your video or whatever. But okay, William, you're
All right, thank you. So thank you. One general thing that I didn't mention that's really important, I think, about why we're all here and why bread was so important during the lockdown, as Pauline mentioned, which is that bread is the food that enabled a break from hunter-gatherer to complex civilizations. And our civilization is literally based on bread. Mesopotamia was built on bread. The pyramids were built on bread. The Parthenon was built on bread. The British conquered the world on bread. And even today, 30% of human calories comes from wheat. It's the largest crop by acreage in the world. So this really is our atavistic food. I wanted to say that. But then I wanted to respond to a couple things or some notes on what Andrew said. So sour was identified with poverty, as well as sour with gastroenteritis, anything that sour gave you a sour stomach. This is before the germ theory of disease was discovered by Pasteur. So, but it was identified with poverty in the UK and the US, where we all had beer and thus yeasted bread. Wherever there were brewers everywhere, Holland, for example, the bread was always yeasted. And only the poorest of the poor had sour bread. So there was that association. A factual bit, the Klondike sourdough people was the end of the 19th century, and they made pancakes. I don't think they made very much bread. They just made pancakes for breakfast. Lastly, in France, while they have extolled the virtues of sourdough, and the big 18th century writers, Parmentier, the person who's most famous for introducing the potato, amongst them, they all said sourdough is better than yeast. It's better than yeast, but they didn't like bread that tasted sour. And I think, Andrew, and those of you that go to France and taste the bread there, until recently, certainly, the levain bread didn't have a sour taste, because the sourness comes from how we handle the bread and is part of that cultural dream of the bread, and is itself a cultural choice. That's what I wanted to say. Thank you.
Thank you. And there's been a lot of comments on the side, so anybody want to bring that to the fore and speak about it? Truly, there's someone else. Nobody has any questions, any comments?
Yeah, just a question really about following on from what William said about some sourdough not being sour. I once really got into doing sourdough every week, and it became not really that sour. I didn't do it on purpose. It just kind of happened that it wasn't that sour anymore. It was good because my children prefer it not too sour. So I don't know what the actual process. I mean, I really respect all your knowledge about science, Andrew, especially, and I can't get my head around it myself. But why? You know, I just wondered why it didn't end up so sour, but it was still sourdough, if you see what I mean.
Well, yeah, I mean, there are ways of creating sour or less sour sourdough bread, and basically sourdough describes a process in which there's an interplay of yeast, which will be the raising agent of the enlargement of the dough, and the lactic acid bacteria, which are souring the acidifying the dough, and thereby doing various transformative things to the flour, but also controlling the fermentative medium in various important ways, so that there are enzymes which either work or don't work better in sour or less sour environments. And the typically, I think I would agree with you, William, in terms of very recent French bread, but I think it depends on which part of France and which, whether it's urban or rural. You know, I think that rural people tended to have, arguably perhaps doing more physical work, actually craving that that completeness of flavor that you get when there is a distinct sourness, rather than the kind of the quickly risen, very lightly soured effect that you can get if you simply, I mean, technically what you need to do is to refresh the starter frequently in order to slightly boost the ratio of yeasts to acidifying bacteria. If you leave it lying around for a long time, then the acidity builds up and it controls the yeast activity to a larger and larger extent. So if you can keep the lactic acid bacteria at bay while your yeasts are multiplying fast and raising your bread, then you get less sour bread. Fairly crude way of describing it, but that's more or less what happens. And of course, in France, quite a lot of bakers chuck in a bit of baker's yeast as well to speed the final proof, which in the Real Bread campaign we regard as cheating, to the extent that it's only being done to speed up a process which all the evidence suggests is better if you can allow it as much time as it needs to do its own thing naturally. That balance between the yeasts and bacteria in the right conditions, and those can be manipulated, of course, by the baker in terms of water content and temperature, particularly temperature of bulk fermentation or final proof. But if you manipulate that to your satisfaction, then you will get the results which balance the digestibility and nutritional quality, and of course the acceptability. And that's a really good point. Elizabeth, you made in the chat, I noticed you were just asking about what happens when people don't like your bread or reject it because of real allergies or maybe assumption about allergies which are not completely correctly attributed to either gluten or wheat or whatever. And that's a really important issue, that, you know, bread doesn't exist unless people are actually going to eat it in the family situation around the table. And so there's got to be an element of to and fro. What I'm particularly engaged in now, we're doing a project within our organisation, Scotland the Bread, which is called Flour to the People. You can see a bit about it on our website. And we're trying to get freshly milled wholemeal flour from our diverse grains grown here in Scotland to community food hubs, where it can really make a difference to people who've been put at even more disadvantage in terms of food security by COVID and the rush to grab flour and bread by those with sharper elbows than some other people have. And it's highlighted the fact that the deal for poorer people has always been a bad one in terms of food. And it's mediated by the choices about our food that are made by the powerful. I've been rereading a book recently called The Bread of Our Forefathers by William Ashley, and he does quite a lot of primary evidence about the way in which we grew a lot more rye than we think we did in the UK, but that the monks, before the dissolution of the monasteries in the UK in the 16th century, the monks made sure that they ate the wheat bread, and the poorer people, their servants or the villeins or cottars or people in the sort of feudal and post-feudal system, they ate the maslin, which was a mixture of wheat and rye, or indeed the pure rye. And I very much doubt if that rye was leavened with anything other than what we would now recognize as sourdough. But we seem to have lost, well, we know there is nothing about this in the literary tradition about bread making, because of course it's not even in the records sometimes of the estates, because it was just what they ate. And it was perceived, although arguably it was more nutritious than what the monks were eating, the very fine white flour. Nevertheless, it was perceived as being the kind of the poorest quality that only those people could aspire to. And of course, with the Industrial Revolution, we've done a complete nutritional inversion, so that now the deal, if you're poor or don't have much income, all you can aspire to is the white bread, which was previously the preserve of better off people, but which actually is now engineered to be as cheap and as non-nutritious as possible in order to keep the price down.
Okay, thank you, Andrew. Kathy, you're up next.
Hi, everybody. Nice to see you. Thank you. Very interesting. Really great to talk about all of this. I could talk forever about bread. Really interesting questions to me that come from, I guess, almost what everybody is saying is that, in a way, every sort of period of time, bread forms different breads form a profile, like a class identification profile, so that sometimes poor people are identified with whole wheat or maslin or rye bread, and sometimes wealthy people are. And it would seem to me just kind of outlining the profile of good bread, nutritious bread right now. We have a product that I worked for a long time in a community of poor people, mostly people of color, and there were some very nice bakeries not in the next neighborhood, very really great bakeries. The stuff was beautifully produced. It was great tasting. It was good for you, and they never went near those bakeries. I mean, they would make a big detour around them because they identified those places as people not like them, people who had a lot of money to spend on food, on something that they thought you could get very cheaply, bread. You could get it very cheaply. Why would you spend all this money on expensive bread? And so, I think bread starts gaining a kind of a character or identity or personality. And I fear that nutritious bread is becoming something for highly educated men to make, for highly educated and wealthier people to consume. So the cultural signals, in other words, that are going out to people prevent them from experiencing it. I worked mainly with teenagers, and I tell you, I mean, I would try to do baking classes with them, and they would bake cookies, or they would want to learn how to bake a cake, but they certainly weren't going near, baking anything like whole wheat bread. So maybe this is too provocative, but I just wondered, hearing kind of bits and pieces of this throughout the talk from various people, what you think about that.
Could John? Are you there?
Yeah.
John
Yep.
is I haven't heard anything about it since I interviewed you, I don't think. But when I did go to your bakery and interview you, you talked about trying to introduce quality breads, whole wheat, wholemeal breads into schools. And that's something that interests me, because how do we get, and following on from Kathy's question or comments about, quality bread only goes to a certain, or made by, or is consumed by a certain segment of society. How do we get more people, the broader population, to start changing their eating habits? Bread in terms of this conversation, but more broadly, food in general. and in Scotland, and particularly here in Glasgow, that's a particular problem. So maybe you could answer both Kathy's question and talk a bit more about how do we get kids to eat their wholemeal bread.
Okay, cool. Now, if I cut out, can you just wave at me so I don't talk for a minute without you hearing me? Okay.
It was only a few seconds, John.
Okay, no worries. I will try to be I'll try to be as quick as I can. It's really interesting because quite a bit of the discussion is touching on what I've been thinking about. The Bread in Schools project came about initially on a panel on a discussion amongst my table at something called Common Grains, which was a gathering of bakers, farmers, millers put on at the Bow House where Andrew lives. Andrew was on my table and we spoke about what we could do. Andrew raised the issue of bread in schools. I'm a bit of the William Rubel approach to sort of food and I'll say I'm the Michael Pollan approach in terms of in defense of food, where he talks about all the good things, about the principles behind good food, and that's eat food. In other words, don't eat stuff that is labeled as food, but that has all sorts of non-food additives, mostly plants, not too much. He's a supporter of organic farming, and yet he says it's better to eat junk food in a really positive social environment than to eat perfect food and be neurotic and obsessed with food. And I guess that resonates with me. And yet, my favorite bread is now a loaf of wholemeal bread that we make. And there's quite a bit of technique to it. So I would say that a lot of wholemeal bread I don't enjoy eating. And I do find it quite worthy, and I'll eat a piece and I'll feel, oof, like that doesn't feel like it's digesting really well. By the same token, there's a whole lot of really bad white bread. So try to get to the point. The Bread in Schools project, the idea is to get good bread into schools, and I'm just starting with my local primary school. I'm not aiming big at this point. And it's going to be a wholemeal loaf, partly because it's a loaf that I love, but also I think it's kind of, the students have started growing some grain. So if we can take some of their grain, we can mill it, I can show them how to, I can make a loaf of wholemeal bread with them that is delicious, then I think that's creating a relationship with food and with a very real food that has so much context around it that you've all been talking about, that could actually quite fundamentally change the way their relationship with food, in a small way, possibly, in a big way, possibly. So I think it's really important to get food to everyone and not just the people who can afford it. So in the classroom, you've got everyone. In a town like Comrie, where I am, you've got two sides of the town. You've got those very quite affluent people, often incomers, people who might work for weeks at a time overseas and then come back to their lovely house and stunning place. And you've got people who are living in housing commission, but they all go to the same school. And the idea is if we can get really good bread to those children, but not only that, if I can go in and do some milling with them and bake some bread with them, then my experience is that even the ones who might not be of that class or that social standing, they're going to be just as enthusiastic about it as the others. So yeah, fundamentally, I think it's a really exciting project. But I also think that it might not only be wholemeal. What I want to see is what I'd love to do is make the wholemeal bread with them, but sift some flour make another bread with them and try to get really candid feedback from them about what they really like. I don't want to ram wholemeal down their throat. So yeah, yeah, that's where that's coming from. I hope I've covered some of the points.
Just before we go on to Elizabeth, who's next in line, Pauline, John used the word neurotic about a certain neurosis about wanting to, I better not, but you were talking about Michael Pollan.
I didn't just to say that I didn't really want to use that word. I sort of
that's a good word because
I think, yeah,
because Pauline talked about the not wanting life to be, or accepting life as it is, and there I also think that there's a certain neurosis about certain diets where you can't deviate from, you just can't have any meat or any sugar or any this or that or paleo this and that. So I was just wondering about Pauline's what Pauline said before. If you want to say something, Pauline, or
I'd love to say something, Zev. Yeah, I think it's a really important point. There's a few things I'd like to follow on from what John says, but what you're talking about, there's actually a name for now in eating disorder terminology, which is called orthorexia, which is an obsession with healthy eating, which is of course incredibly unhealthy. And people who are eating to manage their anxiety, and it's characterized by people cutting out whole food groups and getting very, very anxious if they're presented with something that has carbs in it or has dairy in it or whatever. So it's, joking apart, it is a real problem. One of the things I was thinking as you were talking, John, and I thought it was a great question, Kathy, I think it's quite difficult to talk about these things without fearing being patronizing and that sort of thing. But I think it was Marie, Zev, I can't remember if it was in the film or in the last panel discussion, who brought up the issue of palate and people's, this is in the Glasgow High Rise project, and people having their palates changed and having the opportunity to develop their palates. And one of the things that I'm acutely aware of is that the way that food manufacturers, the word that comes to mind is dope, but it's not quite right, but they're sort of doping people with the sugar and the salt and the refined carbohydrates and the ultra refined sugars and all of those things. And it does have an impact on how we taste food. If you're fed on this sort of diet, come back to William and sourness, then something that might a perfectly palatable piece of sourdough might feel absolutely unpalatable for somebody who has been given food that is massively overprocessed and lacking in nutritional value. So there are a number of reasons why the sort of work that John's doing, I think, is incredibly important, just to give people an opportunity to have a wider access to good food. I think that the wider political issue of the way that food is manufactured in this country and the States and elsewhere is sort of bordering on the criminal, really, that there's this massive hidden subsidy of these companies through the health service, which pays for everyone to get better after they've got ill because they've eaten all the crap food, makes them better again, sends them out so they can buy more high processed, beautifully packaged, very, very dishonestly described foodstuffs. So anything we can do to help children earlier, I think, to have access to real food, wonderful. Sorry, sermon over.
All right, that's great. Elizabeth?
Well, mine, am I unmuted? Yes, I am. It's a sort of general question, which is that I'm not that keen on California sourdough. I like a dense crumb with a thick crust. And and when I lived in southern Spain in the 70s, the local baker sold by weight. You got a kilo loaf that was about that size, or a 2 kilo that was about that size. And it would have been very short-changing to his customers if they weren't exactly what was expected by weight. So that means a uniformity of baking. Yes, it was a wood-fired oven. Yes, they were milling locally with the old way, threshing with the donkey, milling with the stone, and there was quite a lot of home baking. But the baker was on the road, so people would stop and pick up their bread, which I did. And they wouldn't have given you a thank you for sourdough, particularly the ones with holes. The whole point of it was, but I don't know how it was achieved because I've never managed to do it. I don't know if it's to do with the flour, but it was sourdough because it came, they never used yeast. It was from one day to the next, and they very many of them, and they also added, which simply horrifies everybody, a shovelful of lime to the mix, which meant there would probably be in each loaf, there would have been a tiny speck of it. And the village was called Pelayo, and everybody in Pelayo was famous for having impeccable teeth. They never had any holes in their teeth. So all of that kind of knowledge, and I don't know what happened to bread sold by weight. Anybody tell me? That's it.
They still sell it by weight in Germany.
It is.
It's still sold by weight in the UK and has been since 1256 or something. It's slightly freer than it was when I started baking in the 70s, where you had to, if it was baked in a tin, it had to be certain defined weights, 14 ounces,
True.
28 ounces, and so on. Now you've got to declare what weight it is if it's packaged like that, but you can do other weights. But the trading standards don't enforce this anymore because it's assumed that because the basic unit of bread is so cheap, the industrial white sliced bread is so cheap that the chances of a baker exploiting somebody on the basis of puffing something up to look more than it actually is by weight, which was always the issue in earlier days, hence adulteration, and lime, chalk in 1800 was regarded as an adulterant.
Yeah,
Chalk in 1961 or 53 goes into our bread as a mandatory fortificant to replace the calcium removed by milling. So the same substance, calcium carbonate, was regarded as a potential poison and is now a fortificant to replace some missing nutrients. That's the illogic of the manipulation of our food system. And I think, Pauline, you're absolutely right about the way in which the dishonest presentation of this is what's at fault, because people eat what they're accustomed to eat. There are cultural patterns. I was wanting to say that in the 90s and particularly in Cumbria, there were lots of charitable groups that brought over invited groups of children from the shadow of the Chernobyl explosion in '86 to come over for 2 or 3 or 4 weeks of respite, really, to get some fresh air and water and so on. And they stayed with local families. And I knew one group who used to bring a group of children from Ukraine and Belarus mainly, but Russian speaking, to my bakery. And it was a matter of considerable surprise to them that the baker could actually address them in their own language. It was great fun for me to be able to practice my Russian a bit. But the main astonishing thing was that after a couple of weeks with British families, where they'd been effectively bewildered by being given white sliced bread, they came into my bakery and saw loaves of my Russian rye bread, and they just said, "Oh, nash chlieb, our bread." These are children, smallish children, at primary school age. And the idea that children won't either eat their crusts or eat bread that has a pronounced sour flavor is, of course, nonsense. It's just that you need to feel that is what nourishes you in the bosom of your family, and that's what you love. And I think that sort of revealing to us all in our various ways the way in which we constantly, in a class-ridden society, use food as a manipulation of other people, of control. You know, we express our the observation in the chat was wonderful about the software engineers. I mean, I had lots of people coming on my courses, my Bread Matters courses, who were from an IT background, and they were really into the rules and all that, the complexity and so on, William. It's a great observation. But you know, in a way, they're trying to expropriate something from the rest of society by this, not consciously, not saying they want to do anyone else down, but the feeling of well-being they get from that kind of baking and sort of colonizing that area of expertise in the household or indeed in society is a way of differentiating, of establishing a segmentation of society and therefore the market, which just does the same thing that this has always done with bread. It's penalized the poor and those who get the bum's rush at the bottom end of society. And we've got to do something about that. The only way we will do, I think, is to animate the outrage that people ought to feel that this is still going on, and to reveal it for what it is, and then invite people to engage with a more just and fair and respectful food system, which is kind of what we're trying to do by getting better flour to people with no ifs or buts or compromises, you know, and we're not trying to force it down their throats. And I completely buy what John says about the need to learn by doing and taste and change cultural ways by actual exposure, and actually, crucially, the conviviality of doing it with other people, which is what you've all kind of said more eloquently than I can.
Okay, James. Thank you, Andrew. James, are you there?
Yeah, I am.
Okay.
I won't put my video on just because my internet's not particularly great. I had a question, kind of building on from a few of those things. It sort of pertains to types of flour. I recently come back from living in Switzerland for the last 4 years, back to Scotland, to Glasgow. But prior to that, I'd worked as a chef for 10 years in Glasgow and Edinburgh. And something that struck me in the time I spent making bread in Switzerland was the range of flours, such that, I mean, there was a significantly less focused idea on, say, just protein content. And the UK seems to suffer, at least superficially, from this sense of that there's only a few classifications of flour. And I was wondering, when you reach out to these schools or in these different settings where many of you talk or engage with, especially kind of Anglo-Saxon backgrounds, in which it seems to be bread is maybe more of a class issue. I never really noticed it being a problem when I visited my friends in Germany or the Netherlands or Switzerland. Do you expose people to the notion that bread isn't simply, I don't know, 13% protein content? For anyone to pick on, oh, that's jammed, the internet's pretty unstable.
I always, I mean, and Andrew would as well. I mean, I always discuss that with them and talk about what has been seen as good bread making wheat and why, but then give them I mean, I discuss flavor and the importance of flavor, and I mean, generally, the stronger the flour, the less flavor is a pretty general. It's fairly true, I think. So I think there's a discussion around it.
Can I just chip in there? I don't. Zev, stop me if you don't want me to.
Go right ahead. We can have William and Pauline talk a bit about that too.
Yeah. Answering James's point, the 13% protein is a great. It's a great issue, really. I mean, what we're talking about is a certain strength of gluten, which can, without too much skill on the part of the baker produce a reliably well risen loaf. And so it sort of facilitates the widest possible uptake of home baking, really, without putting people off by making it all too difficult. And so I do find myself growing grains that are, sort of 10.5 to 12% protein, really, in Scotland. Trying to find ways of not apologizing for that, even though I recognize that at some level it does make it more difficult for people to use the flour, but to explain why it is that grains grown locally in typical summers are like that, and then to concentrate on the positives that might come out of that people might actually begin to sort of piece together a different narrative about what constitutes quality and attributes in local grains that they might actually vote for, as it were. One is the softness of the gluten, its extensibility, the lack of maybe some of those epitopes of high molecular weight gluten in subunits and so on, which are more challenging to the digestive system, particularly in breads that are not fermented well, and so on. And the notion that you've got to beat 7 bells out of your flour because to develop the gluten, which you have to with very strong flours, because otherwise they will turn into these very elastic, tight bound, not very pleasant to eat loaves. So you don't have to do that. So we're actually saying less metabolic or electrical energy has got to go into mixing our flour into dough. But there's another issue, which actually it seems to me, has the ability to engage people in the fact that we're trying to do something which is to deliberately choose a different route from the standardization of the commodity wheat market and the control that hands lock, stock and barrel into the hands of a very small number of people who aggregate or choose grains from farmers and set the specifications for contracts. And it's around the issue of the falling number, which is a measure of the amylase activity in the grain. When you have a wheat or rye that's been harvested a little bit late, it's got a little bit wet when it's ripe, and it's begun to sort of imagine that it's time to start growing again. You get a conversion of starches in the flour into sugars, maltose sugar, and you also get a more active amount of amylase enzyme, which when you mix that flour into dough can make the dough sticky as though you'd put a lot of sugar in it. Now you can handle the stickiness of the dough up to a point, but the problem is that with a very active amylase in the dough at baking time, when it raises up to 50 degrees during the baking process, amylase goes mad and you get this implosion of the loaf into a sticky mess, which will be uncuttable. It'll never come off your knife. Now that falling number, as it's called, due to the test that they do with it, that measure of amylase is used by grain aggregators and millers to manipulate the price and control the price downwards to the farmer, because they can always say, well, we're not going to accept anything with a falling number below 250. That's the industry standard, even though it's possible to make very good bread with falling numbers much below that. And the reason is simple, that they want to be able to push farmers to aspire to much higher numbers, i.e. less amylase in their wheat, get them to cut it with massive combines very, very fast at the earliest possible opportunity to avoid any sprouting, so that the millers can add back fungal amylase from a synthetic source into their grist so that they can produce an absolutely standardized product which will behave the same way in industrial bakeries every day of the year. And so it has absolute logic to it. It's just that everybody loses except the person who is determining the price of grain and the specification against which it's bought. And The bakers obviously win in the sense that they get a consistent product, but even then they have to put a whole lot of additives in it to turn it into the stuff that most bakers currently make. And my point is to say that if we're going to learn to appreciate the product of individual farms or areas, relocalize our grain supply on the basis of agroecological principles of growing, then we've got to actually embrace and celebrate the variability and the diversity of the quality that we'll get from year to year, or even from batch to batch, field to field, and so on, because we're not doing any standardization. And that means becoming more skillful in making bread with falling numbers and gluten levels, which will oscillate to some extent. And for me as a baker, that's an opportunity to learn and to exercise a craft skill. But I do understand that it requires us to be more extremely sympathetic and kind of engaged with end users, ordinary people trying to make a loaf of bread for themselves and their families, you know, who are maybe not yet anything like ready to embrace all that kind of airy-fairy stuff about variety and variability and diversity. So it's a long argument, but for me, it will never get anywhere unless we really nail the compromises with quality, nutritional quality, and so on, and the centralized monopolistic control of our food, which these systems impose on us. If we can start to get some agitation against that, then it'll be much easier for people to embrace the alternatives with all the variety and complexity that they may present to novice bakers.
Thank you.
It's
anybody?
a big problem. Sorry.
Sorry, James. Sorry, didn't mean to interrupt.
No, it's okay. I just wanted to ask because one of the things, maybe picking up on that or developing a bit further, was that I really didn't know that there was diversity in flour until I left the UK. So once I visited parts of Germany and Switzerland, I really realized just in a normal supermarket, there were a whole range of flours with a whole range of compositions that depended on the region, depended on obviously they measure it by the ash content there, but it didn't seem to be the same problem in the last 4 years when I lived in Switzerland of this homogenized sense of, you know, strong or just very strong. Is this just an Anglo-Saxon problem that you described in your answer, Andrew, or is it really the whole of Europe and North America?
William, do you want to talk about the North American bit?
Okay, I can probably speak certainly to the North American bit, and I think it's the same everywhere in the rich countries. We've just gone through a period in the 20th century of centralizing and making wheat into a commodity product, where there's only a few varieties of wheat grown, and they harvested from all these different farms, and they're all mixed together in a silo. And with that commoditization of wheat was the destruction of small scale storage and wheat cleaning facilities, such that if you just grew a ton of wheat, there was just nothing you could do with it. But in the United States, definitely, and I suspect throughout the UK and Europe, there is now the rebuilding of the local facilities necessary for small scale grain growing. In the United States, the big expression at farmers markets is buy fresh, buy local. So even in where I live in Santa Cruz, where wheat was never really grown on a big scale, there's now a farm that is growing wheat. And each of these wheats, so it requires this infrastructure to be put in place. And in the US, it's coming back. So we now have a huge variety of wheats we can buy from different different purveyors. There's a fabulous book called La Maison Rustique. It first was published in the mid 1500s, and it was kept in print into the 18th century with different editors. And the English edition, which you can all look up at Google Books or archive.org or Hathi Trust, was edited by Gervase Markham, that those of you who are food historians know wrote The English Housewife, which is the source of early modern, the best early modern bread recipes for humans. If you went to my talk last week on animal breads, you'll know he actually developed those recipes for horses. But I digress. In the Maison Rustique edition, he talks about 1616. They talk about bread, flour from different regions in France. Says that the flour from the area Bonn is the best. And if you go online and type in Bonn farine, you're going to get all these agro-tourism websites because it still is considered the best flour in France. And what he said was, if you've got flour from Bordeaux or from this place or that place, it's going to be different, and advised the housewife to watch the dough. So, we all rail against the standardization of food and the destruction of of local food traditions that comes from the chain restaurants and the internet. So, in other words, we have larger cultural sources coming into our houses. So I think that what's happening in the United States for sure, and I don't know, it sounds like a bit slower in the UK from what Andrew is saying, is bakers are using local flours, and they're liking to work with them fresh. And beginning around the 1750s in England, bakers started to age flour. So they didn't want it fresh. They wanted it after a few weeks. So we're going to be seeing, I think, bakers working with the local flours to produce different breads, different bread traditions, local traditions. So that sort of fantastic reversal of historical trend.
All right. There seems to be no more questions. Pauline, did you want to say something, or is this?
Can I just chip in?
Sure.
The simple answer, James, to your question is that when a large number of people in the early Industrial Revolution were shipped off the land and put into single rooms with no cooking facilities, they were dependent on going out of the home to get their food. And the cheapest way of feeding them was bread. And it became important to get as much bread as you could into a commercial oven in serving a community of industrial tenements. And so the tin, the sort of draw plate oven with loads of tins being shoved in very, very quickly by one baker, was a way of getting much more, using vertical height rather than horizontal baking surface, which had been the mode since 14,000 BC or whenever people made bread and it flowed out while it was proving, and they baked it flattish or whatever. It would just express the degree of tenacity of the gluten over fermentation time. But the challenge of getting as much as you could into the oven, which was the limiting resource, meant that you had to push it upright, and that meant a degree of gluten strength, which it just so happened was available from all the wheat pouring out of southern Russia initially, and into the ports of London, Liverpool, Glasgow, Edinburgh, that kind of thing, which was produced on the Chernozem in Russia, and fantastic quality wheat, but much harder, needed different mills to mill it. But the bakers and the farmers kind of gave up growing that kind of grain in the UK. It became the choice of bakers and the mills set up on the seaboard to take in large quantities of this imported grain, from which bakers could make this considerably more elevated loaf going upwards in a tin. And as late as 1870, according to historians, the primary source of British grain was still Russia, and that would be peasant grown, going down to the ships on peasant carts, horse-drawn carts. It was an extraordinary extractive sort of imperial project, like many of the others that our forebears got up to in this country.
Pauline, so Pauline has spoken probably the least. So if there's no more questions, we'll give her the closing words. If there are more questions and people still want to stick around.
I just wanted to point to the connections, I think, between what we've just been talking about and the opportunities from proliferation of different grains, and understand so much better now, again, going back to the microbiome nutrition, and how, you know, somebody else said, I think it was you, John, talking about Michael Pollan, that, you know, real food and diversity is massively important. Tim Spector's new book, Spoon-Fed, is wonderful in explaining so beautifully how the more variety and diversity we have in our grains and in our diets, the better we will do health-wise. People like Vanessa Kimball at the Sourdough School, who are, you know, milling the meadow and looking at really interesting combinations of different grains and adding flours, FLOWERS, as well as the flours we're more familiar with, to her grain mixes, that there are huge opportunities. And it's just so wonderful to hear that, yes, you can go to Switzerland and you can probably go into a baker's and there'll be 50 different sorts of loaves. And that is a wonderful thing. And it's something for us to aspire to. And thank you, everybody, for all the contributions. It's been wonderful to be part of this. And thank you very much, Zev, for organizing it.
My pleasure.
Well done,
Thanks
you.
to everybody for coming, for participating, for everything. So there will be, the first one was about community, and people were from, the panelists were from around Scotland, and this one, and I want to do a third one probably in the early next year about the history of bread. So we shall talk about that then. So nobody else? Last chance? No? Well, thank you. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Pauline, John, Andrew, William.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Cheers. Bye.
See you
Thank
next time.
you.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.